Welcome to today's National Soil Survey Center webinar, Dynamic Soil Properties, Fiscal Year 2021 and Beyond. My name is Sean McVeigh, National Training Coordinator for the Soil and Plant Science Division, and I'm delighted to be your host today. This webinar is being recorded, and all participants joined the webinar in listen-only mode. You receive the webinar audio through your device's speakers. There is no telephone dial-in. If you're having audio difficulties, please check the various ways your computer speakers may be muted or have their volume set low, including the speaker adjustments available in the Adobe Connect interface. Be sure to turn up the volume if you need. You can maximize your webinar experience in Adobe Connect by shutting down Cisco AnyConnect and any other programs that might compete for bandwidth. This includes email and Microsoft Outlook and instant messaging in Skype. Taking a look at our webinar room layout, Adobe Connect has content pods that include the feature presentation and the chat and Q&A pods. Use the 4-arrow icon in the featured presentation pod to enter and exit the full screen view as you choose. We're here to answer your questions. To submit a comment or question for me or our presenters, use the Q&A pod and type in your question. We'll handle technical difficulties the best we can while hosting the webinar and interact with our presenters to answer your questions during the verbal Q&A period. I want to thank Sky Wills for being here to support our webinar and introduce our presenters. Sky, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you so you can introduce the topic and our presenters.
Hi, Sean. Thank you for having us today. I am really happy to introduce Francine Laripier, a detailee for us here at the center coming from Colorado. So Francine has a BS in forestry from the University of Montana and a master's in soils and biogeochemistry from UC Davis, and her master's research was on soil ecology. So it's really a perfect fit for her working with us. She started in NRCS over 15 years ago in southeast Idaho. Idaho Falls MLRA office, actually, and she participated in one of the first pilot projects that was done for DSPs before I started working on it. So she was a resource soil scientist in Idaho and then Colorado, and she's been an acting state soil scientist in Nevada, which really piqued her interest in state leadership. So for the last 4 years, she's been an area conservationist in western Colorado, and she's focused on field operations, conservation planning, and practice implementation. And so the last 4 months, we've really gotten to know Francine and work with her here at SPSD, working on this DSP program. She was updating guidance and NASA's procedures specifically, but she's really taken that and run with it. And it's a little bit bittersweet for me to introduce her today because this is her wrapping up her detail and telling us all about the work she's put into finalizing the guidance for FY21. So Francine, do you want to get started, or do you want me to go on into the background?
I will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, Sky, for your introduction. And I'm sure, as most of you listening are aware, the DSP program and the DSP protocols would not be where they are today if it wasn't for Sky's 15 years of work on DSPs, including before she came to work for the NRCS. So thank you, Sky. And in addition, we're building on the foundation from Arlene Tugel, Kathy Siebold, and so many others who have been involved in soil quality, the Soil Change Guide, and numerous other efforts over the years. Specific to the fiscal year 21 DSP National Bulletin and guidance, there were many major contributors, including Jen Mason and the DSP team, Dee Peterson, who is also on a DSP detail, Chad Remley, Guy Wills, Ankandayo Adeliki, and Kyle Stevens. So in addition, there are many other staff that were reviewers or posed questions and contributed to this effort by helping us to see where the previous guidance could be clarified or enhanced. So as you can see from this long list, this is truly a team effort. So with that, I'm going to ask the first poll question. Bring it onto the screen here. And we'll give everyone a moment to answer this question. Rate your knowledge of the DSP program and protocols at the beginning of this webinar, with 1 being a novice and 5 being an expert. All right, I'll give you a few more seconds to get your votes in. All right, it looks pretty stable there, so we'll stop that poll and keep moving on. Okay, so in August, I had the opportunity to discuss the DSP programs with all the regional directors. And the DSP National Bulletin and the DSP Guide were drafted with their concerns and questions front and center. So today's presentation will be organized around some of their questions as I introduce the 2021 DSP National Bulletin and the guidance. So the first question was, will there be webinars? And so I guess since we're all here today, you know the answer is yes. The RD's request prompted this webinar. And then in addition, Dee Peterson will also be hosting a webinar in January on collaboration with conservation staff. And like the DSP webinar from last April, these two new DSP webinars will be recorded and posted for future viewing. So some of their other questions included, can the guidance be in, can all the guidance be in one place? Are there examples in the guidance? Where should Soil Survey Office staff start? Are the methods spelled out? Where will all the DSP data be stored? And how will the DSP data be used? So when digging into DSP policy, the place to start is the fiscal year 21 DSP National Bulletin. And like the 2020 DSP National Bulletin, the 21 National Bulletin requires that all offices collect extensive tier DSP measures as part of dispersed data collection efforts. So the data collection types are defined in the Soil Survey Manual from 2017, Chapter 9, and the different tiers are defined in the National Instruction listed below. So dispersed data collections are basically those that are integrated into routine soil survey operations. So what does this mean? So when you're describing a pet-on in the field, you'll also include earth cover kind, cracks, crusts, pediderm class, structure, roots, and pores. And with that, I'm going to bring over the next poll question. And just to frame this a little bit, you know, since we're just gearing up on our DSP efforts, we just want to get a sense of where people are at with the extensive tier measures. And Sean, I might need help making that bigger. Thank you. So go ahead and take a minute to read through it and pick the choice that best represents where you're at with the extensive tier measures. All right, another 5 seconds to get those final answers in. All right. All right, so in addition to the dispersed extensive tier, there's also intermediate and intensive tier under the dispersed DSP data collection type. The intermediate tier measures, oh, I'm going to wait for my slide to catch up here. Okay, so the intermediate tier measures are described in the field or measured in the Soil Survey Office lab, and they include ecological site ID and community, vegetation measurements as appropriate, soil moisture, soil temperature, bulk density, infiltration, saturated hydraulic conductivity, earthworms as appropriate, a soil health field assessment that can be local if there is a local one, or national, land use and management questionnaire, water stable aggregates, and POC. So the standardization of these measures is really important to our short and long-term outcomes. For instance, KSAT and bulk density are very important to soil interpretations. So any exceptions to these measures need to be approved by the National Leader for Soil Research, Guy Wills. Each subsequent tier includes the tiers below. So the intensive tier includes the extensive and the intermediate tiers as well. So the intensive tier measures are sampled in the field and sent to KSSL for analysis. And they include this long list. It is really important to make sure that your intensive tier efforts have gone through the appropriate channels, including supervisory approval and KSSL request for assistance process. KSSL needs to be looped in the entire time so that they can anticipate workload and also make sure that they're going to have the needed supplies to send out when they're requested. All right, so the second data collection type is a DSP project, not to be confused with a NRCS project. So DSP projects are designed to evaluate specific land management conditions and require an NRCS conservation staff sponsor. This could be a DC, a resource soil scientist, a state soil scientist, even an AC. So DSP projects should address a locally relevant conservation question. And as outlined in the DSP National Bulletin, update offices, meaning those offices not completing initial mapping, are required to complete data collection efforts at the intermediate or intensive tiers. So for intermediate or intensive tier efforts, and a work plan are needed, and management questionnaires are also needed per location. So another key piece of information from the National Bulletin is that samples will be collected and measurements made from at least 3 locations for each land use or management system under evaluation for an intermediate or intensive tier effort. So can all the guidance be in one place? It's not exactly in one document, but it's as close as we could get. The fiscal year 21 National Bulletin provides one link to the DSP guide, and the DSP guide, along with the 2021 DSP tiers and NRCS guide, contain the information needed for the majority of DSP efforts. These are living documents, and as staff use them, there will be ongoing opportunities to improve them. So one of the goals of these documents is for you not to feel like you've been dropped in a jungle with a machete to create your own path, but that there are clear paths to follow. There's still going to be important junctions where you're going to need to make decisions as to which way to go, but you shouldn't feel like you're having to cut your own path. And if you get to feeling that way, please reach out and let us know, because you've likely found another place in the guidance where further clarification is needed. All right, this is a sneak peek of the table of contents for the DSP guide. If you hit your control key and then left click on your mouse on a table of content item, there's a hyperlink that will take you to that section in the document. Many documents that were standalone documents in the past have been made appendices. And again, this is an effort to get as much of the information that you'll need for DSP efforts into one document as possible. All right, this is the second key reference. This is the old DSP Tier Spreadsheet that I'm sure you guys remember from previous years. And this year it has some enhancements. So on the first tab, which is the Tiers tab, there is now information on data collection that lets you know when to collect the information and from where, and how the samples are packaged if needed. So for example, for the SSO lab assessments for the intermediate tier, you'll need a Ziploc. Or for the water stable aggregates at the intensive tier, you'll need the KSSL provided pint containers. There are also 4 entirely new tabs. There is a NRCS data entry guide on the second tab, and the third and fourth tabs are new sampling depth worksheets that Matt Bromley and Sky Wills developed. And then the fifth tab is a list of materials that Uncandayo Adeliki developed. And that brings us to our next few poll questions. So the first poll question is for everyone. Please select the choice that best describes your position. The first series of choices are Soil Plant Science Division, SSO staff, technical support staff, regional directors, NSSC staff, and headquarters. If you're listening in your conservation staff at the national, state, or area or field office levels, there's an option for you, or if you're other. So with that, I'll give you a moment to answer that poll question. There's still quite a few of you that haven't responded yet, so if you're listening in, please click that arrow button that represents what your role is. And with 5 more seconds, we'll move on to the next 2 questions. Okay, so the next questions, there's actually 2 of them. And if you are in an update office, meaning you are not completing initial soil surveys, answer the first box. Having a hard time getting them situated here. Just a moment. Okay. Thanks, Sean. And if you are in an initial office, answer the second. So the choices are the same. So select the choice that best describes your DSP efforts. Are you getting familiar with the DSP guidance and building partnerships with conservation staff? Are you planning your first DSP intermediate or intensive data collection effort? Have you already completed DSP intermediate or intensive data collection effort? Or have you completed more than 2? And this will be for those staff that are in SSO offices. All right, just 5 more seconds. All right, thank you. Oh, I'm moving the wrong thing, Sean. All right, so there we go. Okay, so the next question is, are there examples in the guidance? And so there's a theme here. Yes, yes, there are. And so first before I share all the examples, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different project kinds. So for the dispersed data collection type, there's one project kind, it's range of values. And project kinds are defined in the Soil Survey Manual, Chapter 9. And dispersed range of values can be extensive, intermediate, or intensive tier. If they're intermediate or intensive, they will require a work plan, a NRCS project, and management questionnaires per location. And in the project data collection type, there are three kinds of project kinds. There's baseline or reference study, soil change study, which is phase for time, and the newly proposed project kind, which is repeated measure studies. And the projects are always sampled at the intermediate or intensive tier, and they all require a work plan, NRCS project, and management questionnaires. So the 2021 DSP guide also includes a decision tree to help you figure out the tier, data collection type, project kind, and what project type to populate in NRCS for your DSP data collection effort. There are many examples in the 2021 DSP guide, but I personally think some of the most valuable are the examples of the different types of DSP data collection efforts in Section 6. Really briefly, this is what Section 6 looks like in the guidance, but we're going to talk through some additional examples now in more detail. So example 1 is a dispersed data collection type, meaning it's part of routine soil survey operations. This project kind was range of values, and the tier was intermediate. So a soil survey office in Washington developed a project to collect DSP data on a major component that occurs across the MLRA. They were already completing PEDON descriptions as part of the soil survey update project, where they were investigating the epipedon thickness and KSAT. Of their update project sites, they've selected 5 to include in their DSP effort. The extensive and intermediate measurements were made in the field and the Soil Survey Office lab. In addition, the management questionnaires were completed at each of the 5 locations, and data was populated in NRCS. So for this Washington project, they used the typical plot layout of 2 satellite pedons and 1 main pedon. The distance from the main pedon and the satellite pedons is typically 10 meters, but professional judgment is needed to determine the plot size and the distance between the main and the satellite pedons so that the variability of the soil across the landscape is adequately captured. The main pedons are typically sampled to 100 centimeters or greater as needed for positive soil identification, and the satellite pedons are sampled to 50 centimeters or greater as needed for probable soil identification. So the plot distribution in this Washington example included 5 plots, as is typical for dispersed range of value efforts. The distance between the plots is variable, but as much as possible, the plots should represent the variability of the extent that that soil occurs. If the plots don't represent the extent of the soil, then we can't leverage the existing soil survey data as well and stretch that data to represent the full extent of the soil. You know, we can say great things about that one tight cluster of plots, but overall the effort has less value to the future application of DSP data. So it is really important to think about the extent of the soil. Please also note that because this is an intermediate effort, there's no pedon or no main pedon that's being sampled for full characterization. So in the second example, we have a data collection type of a project. The project kind is baseline or a reference study. and the tier is intensive, meaning KSSL, a KSSL request for assistance will be needed. So in this example, a soil survey office in Georgia developed a project to collect baseline data on a forested reference state. There was one soil in the reference state and identified in the SPSD state and transition model that was investigated at the intensive tier. So in this example, there were 3 plots total. For this project, due to variability, the team opted for an alternate plot layout that included 1 main and 4 satellite head-ons. The ecological site specialist collected vegetation data, and the soil scientists completed the head-on descriptions. The extensive and the intermediate measures, including the management questionnaires, were made in the field and the soil survey office lab. So the samples were collected for the intensive tier measures and sent to KSSL. One of the main head-ons was also sampled for full characterization, so this is an intensive project tier. So there is one head-on that sampled for full characterization per soil or land use or management, basically soil per treatment. The data was also populated in NRCS. So that should be coming up as another theme. The data was populated in NRCS. So stepping away from this example for a minute, the typical plot layout is a main head-on with 2 satellite head-ons. And for intensive tier efforts, a minimum of 1 head-on per soil per land use or management is sampled to 200 centimeters or greater for full characterization. But getting back to the Georgia example, since the Georgia team opted to go with 4 satellite head-ons, this is what their plot looked like. And again, please note that professional judgment is needed on the plot size and the distance between those head-ons. So their plot distribution in this Georgia example included 3 plot replicates. And you can see that one of the plots includes a main head-on that's being sampled, that's this yellow X, for characterization sampling as well. Okay, I'm waiting for this next slide to come up. I don't know if you guys can see it on your end. I can. It should be slide 30.
I'm seeing it, Francine.
It's on slide 30.
Okay, great. I'm not seeing it on my end, but I'll just keep going. So in this third example, the third example is a project, and it's also a soil change study or space for time study at the intermediate tier. So a soil change study, the soil change study design enables us to compare and attribute differences in DSPs that occurred over time due to differences in land use or management. So it's a great way to get a lot of information about different land uses or management quickly. So in this example, a soil survey office in Vermont developed a soil change study with one soil, with 3 different land uses. So the samples were collected and the measurements made from 3 locations for each land use under evaluation. And in this example, there were 9 plots total. The extensive and the intermediate tier measures, again, including the management questionnaire. I keep reinforcing this because the management questionnaire is a very important context for the property data that we're getting through our different measures in the different tiers. But so the management questionnaires were made, or the extensive and intermediate measures were made in the field in the SSO lab. So the samples were collected for the intensive tier measures and shipped to KSSL, And one of the main set pedons was also sampled for full characterization for each soil land use combo. The soil was populated, or the data was populated in NRCS. So in this Vermont example, there are 3 plots for different land uses for a total of 9 plots. You can see based on the name that it's soil B in cropland, plots 1, 2, 3, and plot 1 has the main pedon that's also the characterization pedon. And then soil B in pasture, plots 1, 2, 3, and soil B in forest, under forest land use, and plots 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this is the 4th example, and it is again a project data collection type. The project kind is repeated measures, and the tier intensity is intermediate. So a soil survey office in Colorado was contacted by field office staff with a DSP project idea. They had 3 landowners interested in understanding the impact of newly implemented conservation practices on their rangeland soils. They decided to focus the project on one soil of the greatest extent that were present in all 3 ranches, and the ranches conveniently also represented the extent of the soil across the MLRA. So in this example, there were 3 plots total, and the extensive and intermediate measures, including the management questionnaire, were made in the field and the soil survey office lab. The data was populated in NRCS, and what makes this a repeated measures study is that repeated sampling in the same location was planned 5 years after the initial sampling. So in this example, you can see 3 plots on soil F in rangeland in 2021, and again 5 years later in the same location. All right, so this 5th example is a standalone TSS request, or Technical Soil Services request, at the intermediate tier. And in this case, a Nebraska producer converted to no-till 20 years ago, but recently bought a new piece of ground that had been conventionally tilled. The producer was interested in evaluating the new piece of ground and comparing it to the no-till field. The field office staff and the MLRA Soil Survey office staff worked with the producer to develop a sampling plan. And they decided on 1 plot in the no-till and 1 plot in the conventional till. So this example was TSS and not a DSP project because it lacked the required replicates, but the gathered data was still valuable DSP data and was entered into NRCS. And this included the DSP plot ID, so that it could be identified and queried as DSP data. So as a note, another option could have been to develop this into a project to work with, by working with the field office to identify additional locations with the same soil management across the extent of the soil. And for this TSS example, there are 2 plots with different management being compared. So regarding other examples in the guidance, there are also sampling depth examples. There's been some confusion on the typical sampling depths of 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to the top of the genetic horizon, and so on. And so in the 2021 DSP guide, it includes these examples and also a sampling depth decision tree. But basically, the sampling depths are, they also need to be congruent with the genetic horizon breaks. And so those, the sampling depth decision tree and these examples, I hope will help clear that up. In addition, there are examples for sampling depths in the 2021 DSP Tiers and NRCS Guide spreadsheet. These will help you to develop your own plan for intensive sampling effort and include sampling depths and which samples need to be collected from which depths and which pedons. So the next question is, where should staff start? So in addition to reading the National Bulletin and reading the guidance, the 2 guidance documents, there are helpful checklists in this year's guidance. Those include the DSP Effort Planning Checklist, the Field Prep List for Intermediate and Intensive Tier Efforts, the Sampling Checklist for Intensive Tier Efforts, and a Materials List. Regarding materials, if you need emulsimeters or epoxy kits or other supplies for the intermediate tier, please make sure to make a request for assistance and coordinate with your lab liaison. So coordination is really key to the success of these DSP efforts. So visit with your conservation staff to identify locally relevant conservation questions. I've included a few questions here that could help you start those conversations. The first of which is, what are the primary land uses for their service center or in their conservation plans? What are the conservation practices that they plan? Are there conservation practices that additional information could help sell? Do they have questions on how management or conservation practices impact soil properties? Are there map units or components that would benefit from an update? So those are good questions at a minimum to start with to help you and local conservation staff brainstorm potentially good locally relevant conservation questions to investigate. Identify a local conservation sponsor. As mentioned before, this could be a state soil scientist, this could be a resource soil scientist, this could be a district conservationist, this could even be an AC. I can tell you from an AC perspective, I see DSP projects as a great OJT opportunity for new soil cons and range cons. To have them out there helping with the sampling, helping them run emulsimeters will help them to better learn their local soils. As much as possible, please make sure that the plots represent the extent of the soil. It is also important to obtain support from your supervisor and discuss and obtain the support from your tech team and management teams. And submit an annual request for assistance for KSSL sampling and equipment. It is also really important to stay in touch with your lab liaison. So to reiterate some of the key pieces for coordinating with KSSL, in addition to making sure that you submit a request for assistance for the analyses and the equipment, please engage with your lab liaison throughout the process and keep them informed. And then at a minimum of 30 days prior to sampling, email KSSL staff to finalize the needed supplies and equipment. When you do that, please CC your lab liaison and your supervisor, and those lab liaisons are listed here by region. So you'll have this reference after this webinar. So the next question is, are the methods spelled out? Well, yes, they are. So they can be found in the 2021 DSP Tiers and NRCS Guide spreadsheet, and they're kind of spelled out in the methods column, but where you see all those blue X's, that's the actual link to the method. Where will all the DSP data be stored? The DSP data will be stored in NRCS, or is stored in NRCS, I should say. And the second tab of the 2021 DSP Tiers and NRCS Guide spreadsheet is a NRCS DSP data entry, a guide. And so there are a few cases where we're still working on changes to the NRCS data model for the data to fit nicely into NRCS, like some of the management questionnaire data. But that said, the guide lists easy workarounds for getting that data into NRCS for now so that none of it is lost. The NRCS guide can also be seen as a minimum data set for DSP projects. At this point, optional measures like PLFA and biology counts are not included in NRCS. As of this summer, FPAC Business Center prioritized and funded the development of a DSP hub. As conceptualized by Jay Scovlin on a detail a year or so ago, the DSP hub is not intended to replicate where we already have data stored, but rather be a link between where our DSP data is and the context needed for interpreting and making sense of that data. For instance, the DSP hub will link the data in NASIS, LIMS, EDIT, NPAD, and more. There's many divisions in the NRCS and within FPAC that are anticipating outcomes from our DSP data and the DSP hub. The last question is, how will the data be used? And first, I want to thank all of the staff that have contributed to or will be contributing to DSP efforts. These are important efforts. As scientists, soil scientists, ecologists, we know that how soils are managed change the soil properties and hence how the soil functions. The Soil Plant Science Division is being looked at to provide authoritative and scientifically defensible data on how soil properties change with land use and/or management. And the Soil Plant Science Division has the experience and the knowledge to lead this effort, and I'm glad that they are. For those that were involved in the Soil Quality Institute 30 years ago, I'm sure this seems like a long time coming. And as someone involved in one of the first DSP pilot studies 13 years ago, this feels like a long time coming from my perspective too. And as an area conservationist, I see an immediate need for the outcomes of DSP data. And I see the DSP data, or the DSP program, as a critical bridge between the Soil Plant Science Division and the conservation side of our agency. So as you plan your DSP efforts, please consider the short-term return, and those are, that which is valuable, valuable information that local conservation planners and producers receive now, and the longer-term potential of that data. So as more DSP data is populated, bigger picture and more significant outcomes are possible. Those potentially include paradigm-shifting products for conservation planners and land managers. For instance, can we predict the probable outcome of implementing a practice or changing a land use? If we had this information now, we'd already be using it to inform conservation planning and potentially even ranking applications to determine who gets funded. For another example, your DSP efforts will also be needed to develop our next generation soil products that could be applied to addressing potentially global issues related to carbon sequestration. For DSP data to inform some of these bigger outcomes, we need to do what the Soil Plant Science Division is so well known for: collect and store scientific data with a consistent standard in a database, and do so in a way that leverages our existing soil surveys. So as much as possible, develop DSP efforts that investigate soils of great extent or significance. Design projects that represent the variability across the landform or MLRA so that the data represents the largest extent possible. Design projects that build on or inform ESDs and state and transition models. Design projects that have outcomes that benefit conservation efforts today and garners more support for future efforts. So in short, design projects to consider the short-term and the longer-term outcomes of the efforts. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with the Soil Plant Science Division on this 4-month detail, and you are a smart, talented, motivated group of people, and if ever there was a group that can accomplish this, I'm confident that it's you. And now that I've buttered you guys all up, I'm going to ask you the final poll question, which is rate your knowledge of the DSP program and protocols at the end of this webinar, with 1 being novice and 5 being an expert. And we'll pause there so you have a moment to respond.
Oh, great job, Francine. And while people are answering this last poll question, do we want to broadcast the results when you're done with this one, just so people see what that looks like?
Oh, yeah, that would be great.
And I'll give people a few seconds more to finish up their votes on that. But I'll remind people to put in their questions to the Q&A. Chad's been doing an outstanding job answering questions. Good job on that. But there are still a few that they want to answer. So we'll ask our presenters to start their webcams for the Q&A session. And Francine, I think I'll go ahead and broadcast these results if you want to speak for a moment about those results.
Okay.
Everybody sees them now.
Okay, everyone can see them. So I don't have the ones from before right at hand, so I don't know if there was a shift in folks' knowledge of the DSP program and protocols, but we have a pretty good bulge here right at number 3, right in the middle. So that is great. It's showing that we're moving through the adoption curve. And with that, I have one more thing to say before I turn it over to Chad, and that is that, you know, as you plan and you implement your DSP efforts, it's expected that you're going to have questions. And please direct those questions to the DSP focus team via Jen Mason. And again, if you start to feel like you're standing in a jungle with a machete and having to cut your own path, please reach out, because we want to make, this is going to be a whole group effort to learn from each other and to keep improving these processes so we really can develop the data that we need to be able to have these short and long-term outcomes from the DSP program. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chad for webinar questions. Thank you all so much.
Hello, this is Chad. I'm trying to read questions and answer, so please just ask away, and I'll keep trying to get these answers guys on. We'll both try and take care of these. One of the questions has been the common theme coming through. Okay, so if your initial office, you're responsible for extensive part of the tier. Everyone is doing extensive, but initial, you stop there. Update MLRA offices, you have to do one DSP project either to intermediate or intensive level if you're an MLRA update office. So let's make that clear. As far as who pays, that's another common question. If it's within the guidance, NRCS is picking, or SPSD and the KSSL, we're paying for the analysis. If it's something outside the guidance, some extra biological, the Haney test, if somebody wants that, they're going to have to pay for it. So we're not paying for some of those. We're only paying for what we traditionally offer, and what the KSSL has added in recent times. Okay? Let me do more questions here.
So Chad, I see a couple of questions. I think I can take a whack at one of them. There's a mention that this is still pretty complicated, maybe not as straightforward as something like rapid carbon. Rapid carbon was meant to be like a one-time, very standardized push, and I heard a ton of complaints that it was too prescriptive and it didn't work in some situations. So the idea here is, even if it is complicated, that's because we want you to use your professional judgment, be soil scientists, and think about how to do this correctly within the guidance. I know that makes it harder. I know you may have to pick up the phone and call Jen or me or someone else and talk about it, but we're pushing our boundaries here, and that's meant to work everywhere, right? This is not a one-time thing. This is an effort we're going to do for the long haul.
Right. This is an effort we're going to do for the long haul. I think if you go through the DSP guidance document that Francine Sky and everyone worked on, I think there's lots of examples, and you'll be able to get most of your questions answered, but please feel free to pick up the phone and ask. Mark, if you want to talk about it, call me.
The other thing, Chad, do you want to talk about KSAT? or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Well, I think, I feel like we added this in the guidance and it maybe didn't come out in the webinar, but KSAT can be time consuming. You're often set up to do replicates around one pedon. So if you have a setup where you want to do replication around one pedon, you can do the replication just around the main pedon in the center of the plot as opposed to doing it at the satellite location. And you don't have to do every single layer. You can just do the layers that are representative of water flow in that location. Does that sound right to you, Chad?
Yes. Yeah, you want to focus on your concept of what that map unit or that component you're looking at. That's one of the questions we had. What if I have a map unit that has as many as 6 different series? I would certainly want to focus on the main ones. And what is, I guess the first step would be to step back and say, what is the main purpose of this DSP data collection? Are we looking at the crop management? Are we looking at the soil series variability? What are we actually looking at? And then you could design your study based on that question.
And there are some examples of doing multiple soils at once if you want to try to maximize your time. So there's some of that in the soil survey manual, or you could call us if it's going to be really complicated and you're not sure how to proceed. That's a good time to call someone for help. Sorry, go ahead, Chad.
Right. Yes. Question is, there's no sponsor available. Is the SSO responsible for completing a DSP project? Yes. If you can't get anybody to help you, you still have to go out and do one. Hopefully you have some, you can just do a baseline. You can do a range of values study as part of a current MLRA project. There's a couple examples in there in the DSP guide, so there's plenty of opportunity.
So blue carbon came up. I think this is a great, you could definitely expand on this. We have not used examples there because we haven't tried this in that arena yet, but I don't see why it wouldn't work. Sorry, Todd, I interrupted you again. I keep doing that.
I don't have an answer for Ed when he asked about the questions using small cylinders for KSAT at the mechanics lab. I don't know. That would be a question maybe for Deb Harms if they can do that kind of analysis.
Ooh.
For KSAT.
Yeah. Not sure that we do, but there are some options available, and of course it's always an option for research in the future, right?
Correct.
That seems to be, they seem to be slowing down. Anything else you want to chime in here?
Call the DSP focus team. We've got 3 names listed on the bulletin. Take a look at the DSP guide. I think there's lots of good examples in there. Francine did a great job building the decision tree. If you look at pages 25 and 26, and you're worried about the 0 to 5 and how that affects genetic horizons, the sampling depths, you can look at those 2 pages, and I think they'll lead you through that analysis or sampling. So,
yeah.
Sean, I think
yeah, we're trying.
Questions?
Yeah, I think so.
So there was one in the chat that I don't know that was covered, or maybe you could just speak to it briefly. But just at the beginning, how does the DSP project typically get started? Does somebody from like a cooperator approach soil survey office, or is it the other way around? How does the DSP project get started?
Generally, a lot of times in our technical team meetings, there are issues that come up, and through soil health, through just discussing about a series. And I think if you bring up that you're going to be required to do a DSP project, I think you'll find there are plenty of people that want to jump on and help you come up with ideas and sponsor a study. Some of the studies, a lot of our studies have come from the stateful scientists. We were relying on them pretty heavily to come up with, we haven't had to rely on them. They've been coming up with lots of studies for us. And I think if you just ask, you won't have any trouble finding people to work with you.
And there's a question from Delaney in the chat. Do plans have to be approved before implementing, and can it be of land conversion type?
No, the plans do not have to be approved. It would be nice if you did discuss the plans with the liaison. The liaisons are in training, also learning this. If you have questions about your plan, please contact Sky or the DSP folks to help you work through your plan. The other part, to continue on that, there's a question on running KSAT on a change over time. Most things in soils don't happen quickly, so look at the 3 to 5 year time frame before you're on a repeated measure study before you return. There is no reason to go out the next year. You need to allow some time. Anything you want to add to those two?
Nope, I don't think so.
Oh, yeah, so if you're doing an intensive tier, Amber brought this up, you're going to be submitting your samples to KSSL. Make sure, please, to put that in your request for assistance. There's a cost to that, and the KSSL lab needs to know in advance that those samples are coming. So make sure in your request for assistance that you've got those included. No, we will not be doing the handy test. Somebody else will be needing to pay for the handy test.
Mm-hmm.
Will KSSL staff be available to help our soil survey offices with sampling? That is something you'll have to talk to your liaison, given the current environment. I'm doubtful that it's going to happen, but they can certainly provide advice. They probably will not be able to physically help you in the field this next coming year.
So there's a good question here about stretching projects over 2 years instead of 1. I think that is actually a great idea. It's hard to get all the work done in the timeline, especially if you're in some managed situation where you want in and out quickly. Just be careful to maintain similar. Don't do all of one if you're doing a comparison, for instance. Don't do all in one season and compare it to something taking in another season. That can make your results a little flaky, but it's a great idea to spread things out.
Okay. Question on when you would expect to hear on your request for assistance from the lab. I spoke to Deb last night. They're going to begin working on that, and we'll be getting back to everybody as soon as they can. Let's see what else we got in here. Looks like several people are wanting to do baseline studies or range and value studies. There's a lot of needed data out there. You know, you have to have point data before you can begin to model. So we're in a dire needs of point data, so we got to begin collecting it. It'll still take a couple of years to get enough point data before we can really begin to do anything with it. But that's the goal, get as much as we can, then we can begin to come up with modeling. Oh, the question is, would this be TSS? Yes, it would be in most cases it will be TSS. However, if you're doing the soil characterization sampling and you're doing the 2 satellite samples, no, that's just regular soils work. We wouldn't be claiming DSS. We're not actually doing a project.
So, and then letting the lab know. I mean, it's good to know what kind of things you're going to need. Keep in touch with your liaison for both intermediate and intensive projects. And that work plan worksheet, which is in the DSP guide, it's for you to help you plan how you want to do this project, and then it makes an easy way for you to share that information with your liaison, with KSSL, with the DSP focus team, whoever you need to communicate with. It's a good way to organize the information, so use it. There's a question about doing urban soils. There's now a sub-team. You should talk to Randy Riddle. He is leading the DSP sub-team for DSPs in urban soils, and we're not sure what all that will entail yet, and they're working on getting some updated guidelines just for that specific situation. So there's a question about MIR. That we don't have MIR calibrated to predict the things that we measure for the DSP project yet. We'd be happy to work with you to try to make that work in your situation, but we've not got those set up right now, so you do still need to send any intensive samples in. But we could probably do the work so that we get both goals accomplished at once, I would guess.
Right. One of the questions is, how are we measuring progress? The senior regionals are working on DSP milestones, but also, the way I look at it as regional director, if you complete the project, you've submitted the lab data, I would consider that project, even though there's some follow-up, to be basically complete, and we move on to the next DSP project. Right now, with the COVID crisis, the lab is doing everything they can, but they're not fully operating at peak capacity, so it's going to be quite a while before you get your samples back. So I don't think you can wait till your samples are returned to consider the project completed. Somebody's asking if anybody's interested in doing DSP in some aqueous soil. That would be interesting. And then we have a question about doing DSP in urban soil. Oh, you addressed that, Sky. Thank you.
Yeah. That's all right. We're both trying to pull, and stuff comes in really fast.
Someone's taken to IM&me for questions.
Do you think, Chad, that you have any advice for KSAT? I mean, for DSPs, I'm very interested in what's happening at the surface, but I think we do want to know more information about lower depths, especially if you're taking a characterization pit. We really want as much information on those as we can get.
Yes, especially if you're taking characterization pit. Remember, if you're using, for instance, the meter, you need a 15-centimeter head for that, so you're going to have to maybe combine, it'll be more of layers than horizons per se. You'll just have to use best professional judgment to get that data. Okay.
Well, it seems like we've reached about the end of our questions in the chat and the Q&A, and we're at the end of our webinar time. So I want to thank Sky and Francine and Chad for your time and effort to make this presentation, and thanks to all the participants for joining in. We had well over 270 people join today's webinar. The on-demand recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, along with over 150 webinars and training videos. Simply search for NRCS NSSC or this topic in YouTube, and you'll find the recording. Please feel free to let your colleagues within and outside of NRCS know about this training opportunity. And this concludes our webinar.